I'll be running two arguments in this PM speech. First on how healthcare workers has a principled obligation to provide services no matter what, and a second argument on how opposition makes crucial services, for example abortion, borderline inaccessible to certain places. Before that, a couple pieces of modeling. First, we're going to be simply going to ban the consententious objection. We're going to be making sure a doctor must operate on a patient if the patient requires the surgery. First argument on how healthcare providers have a principal obligation to provide these services no matter what. As a healthcare provider, you take on a special role when you provide a doctor or become a hospital manager. You become a specialized role and consent yourself into handling the life of other individuals uniquely. Go ahead.
Where does this debate take place in?
I think this debate takes place in major all the places where this thing existed before. For example, in places where conscientious objection existed, we're gonna ban this in places where it existed. Alright, great. You take on a specialized role and consider yourself into handling the life of other patients uniquely. This is the reason why the state, and therefore the families of these individuals, gave up their autonomy for you to ultimately care for them. This is a transaction of autonomy. Humans gave up a massive amount of personal rights and precautions against in times of need for you as a doctor. Also under the pretense that it is illegal for you to perform surgery on yourself and also buy drugs without a doctor's prescription, you have surrendered an incredible amounts of autonomy to the doctor and the state in general. So in order to give back to this massive violation of freedom and autonomy, the doctor ought to principally perform whatever the patient says in order to save their lives. But also, note how the doctor specifically consented into this role of handling the livelihoods of other individuals and consented into doing all of these things when they signed the Hippocratic Oath, which states exactly that you must operate the best service you have for patients. Before the doctor takes on this job, they have the time to think through this oath and decide on whether or not they're ready to take on this role as a doctor or healthcare provider. Thus, the responsibilities that come with this role is massive, meaning we're not violating the doctor's autonomy on our side. Note, this offensive principle also serves as defensive principle against the side opposition's possible attack on the violation of the consent of the doctors. The doctor consented into, quote-unquote, all situations specifically, and we gave them time to think it through before they became a doctor, not at this moment. Great. Here's the weighing of this independent argument then. We proved how a higher playing field than practicals, doctors and healthcare officials have a moral obligation to care for their patients and do what is best for them. So in the situation this entire debate washes out, we are able to win on this independent principle argument. Second argument on how we protect vital services that go against the opinions of certain individuals. The premise here is that in the status quo, many vital operations that individuals desperately need in life actually go against the teaching of some doctors. For example, getting an abortion, getting hormone therapies, or sex-changing operations. The doctors simply think that this is wrong, or perhaps due to religion, etc. Note, even when a lot of these services are legalized in an area, the doctor may still hold personal grudges. This is why many states in America are fighting to ban abortion right now when they previously did not ban abortion, and how many states who previously allowed for sex change operations are trying to ban gay marriages and also sex change hormone transplants. On our side, comparatively, we're able to force the doctors to perform these vital operations when they lose the ability to opt out. Here's the crucial link of this argument then. Why will the doctors do this well then? Two major mechanisms. First, there's a massive scrutiny by the public, by the patient's family. If they do not do this well, they have the ability to lose their license, to lose their job in the future. But second, note here, laws exist. If a doctor messes up an operation, they can be sued and are legally reprehensible for all these services. I mean, on our side, even if the doctor does not want to do this, they still have a principal obligation to do this on our side. What is the impacting of this argument then? Oh, by the way, one more thing. We think also personal survival is also really important for the doctors for the sake. If they lose a job, they don't have other transferable skills, they do not want to lose this job. But also, we think in many cases, that losing this job is bad for the people that care about, for example, their kids or their wife. We have an obligation to keep doing this on our house. So what is the impacting of this argument then? First, we're able to provide vital services for individuals. Getting an abortion is oftentimes life-saving, but also incredibly important for their family. Many individuals who get abortion are victims of sexual assault. Getting a person to look like a person they feel like is incredibly important for someone's mental health. Gender dysmorphia causes a massive amount of depression every single year. That is why we ought to protect the most vulnerable individuals in this debate. But second, we get individuals who do not do these operations themselves. Many people have lost their lives doing an abortion operation on themselves. We think this is incredibly terrible. We must protect these individuals on our side. Note, even if we're impacting a very small amount of people going through this process, 10 people people will go through an insane amount of pain and suffering. So even if very little people go through this process, we still win on the scale of suffering. But finally, even if some doctor chooses to help you on their side, even if this place is really conservative, we still think that it takes a massive amount of time looking for this one service, because bigots usually come in a group and a demographic area, because a certain demographic area usually have similar educational or cultural values. You know, on our side, on their side, they delay the time for individuals to get services on a massive degree. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Doctors will spend years of their lives working towards saving patients and making sure that people in their communities get the best possible outcomes. For you to pull numerous years of all-nighters in medical school, take on thousands and hundreds and thousands of dollars in debt, you are not going to throw away years of medical training because of one small issue. It has to be a very large issue that you fundamentally disagree with, that will fundamentally change the way you think and your identity, that you are going to make a decision to refuse to do a procedure. I'm going to start off with the frame. Secondly, then, I'm going to introduce arguments on why we get a worse quality of healthcare and why we think that there's a principle as to why this is justified. Then I'm going to go into any direct clash that I have with OG. First, on the frame. Listen, doctors go in for good. That's to say you have a large amount of sacrifice, and the fact that you have to put in so much work towards giving people the best quality of patient care that you can get means that you have some sort of connection to healthcare in general. The implication is simple. That is to say, it's not an easy decision for you as well to walk away from patients, because it is damaging to see how you can work your whole life towards something and not be able to save someone. There's a very high burden. Secondly, we think that generally people who work to save lives of others have good interests at heart. That is to say, if you put in effort to do this, you must want the best for other people. Why do we think healthcare professionals actually act in good sense in most scenarios? First, they have lots of educational experience, meaning they have the understanding of the healthcare capacity and their capacity to deliver care. Secondly, given their experience, they're best able to apply the knowledge that they have to make healthcare better. Third, there's a lack of emotional judgment. There are already laws in place telling doctors that you can't directly influence patient decisions. You can't tell patients that you must do this. You also can't operate on family members. This is to say that they are trained to be emotionally objective during times of need, and that there's only a very slight margin, and that is likely symmetrical on both sides. Fourth, this is a last resort action. That is to say, it is incredibly painful and emotionally wrenching for doctors as well. They also want to see communities succeed. They don't go in thinking that I'm going to turn people away every day and knowingly cause people large amounts of harm. The implication is simple. The extremes of the proposition case already get taken out. First argument then on why the quality of healthcare decreases. I just want to start off by saying that if one doctor refuses to perform a procedure on you, you are likely going to find other doctors to do so. This is very simple. That is to say, if your care is so life-threatening, it's likely that it's going to be trained across a wide variety of fields. We're not going to have only one cardiac surgeon in the entirety of your area that will only be able to perform such a common procedure that it is necessary for you. Second, we think that it's very easy for surgeons to or doctors or providers to generally act in good faith and say, even if I can't provide this care, I will find someone else to, because they also fundamentally understand the individual necessity to seek out healthcare in the first place. Second part is that doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers work in inherently high-stress environments. That is to say that they are often under a lot of pressure because people's lives are directly on their lines. That is to say that in cases where they are forced to perform procedures, they act worse. That is to say that in general, when they act or when they're engaging in their profession, they want to minimize the amount of pressure that is on them. But when you have something that fundamentally contradicts your beliefs, you always have a cloud hanging onto your head. You have things that tell you not to do something. This puts an added stress, and this directly hinders the quality of healthcare that you can perform. But third, note this is extremely important because this directly impacts patient outcomes. It's much better to have a patient directly go to doctors who can say, I am 100% committed to doing very good care, than for a doctor to say, you know what, I'm not too sure about this. I'm going to be extremely nervous. No, thank you. But fourth, why do we think that this conscience is extremely important? That is to say, this is uniquely proximate to doctors. But at the same time, these things can be triggering and bring back trauma. So if a doctor goes into an operation knowing that they fundamentally disagree with the same smells, the feelings, the textures, the lighting, lighting and they go through with this procedure, these things can come back again and impact future healthcare decisions. So when you go back to a similar setting, you're reminded of all those times you went against everything you disbelieved in. You're reminded of all those times you beat yourself up with sleepless nights because thinking you did fundamentally the wrong thing. These impacts are important because this directly impacts the best quality of healthcare that people can get. But let's talk about the principal clash, and my partner will get into more refutations later. Here's why we don't think that here's why we think that doctors have the right to use their own conscience. First, conscience is a fundamental part of identity. It forms your own beliefs, it forms your life system. Doctors have lives outside of healthcare. It forms daily habits such as who you pray to, who you answer to at the same time. This means that if we fundamentally refuse to let doctors think and feel the way they want to, we fundamentally reduce their capacity as a person to behave and fulfill their own lives. This is crucial because this is the most proximate harm that we reach on our side of the house. But secondly, note the model states that this happens in a lot of countries. That is to say, you also don't have the principal right to tell private healthcare facilities that they must operate, given the fact that they did not directly consent into a lot of these measures in general. Proud to oppose.
Doctors take on a specialized role unlike any other because you give up the personal ability for yourself to perform surgeries, to be able to buy drugs, all of that, so that the doctor can do it. We think that the doctor has no right to employ their own feelings on the ability for you to access things, because otherwise you could just do it yourself, but you cannot, and that's why they are fundamentally obligated to do it. I'm going to first talk about what opening opposition told you. I'm going to bring back our two arguments and explain why we win this debate through two paths to victory. First, what does opening opposition say? They give this frame about how these are probably not going to be small issues. People have good faith interests of other people. People are probably going to understand their healthcare capacity. They're probably going to be trained to be emotionally objective. Like, we just don't think they're probably going to be emotionally objective at all because of the fact that often they have a religion that they might believe in, and we don't think that they should probably going to tell them that you should not do this surgery. We don't think it is probably going to be a last choice. I'll explain later why that's true. But on their argument about how you can probably find other doctors to do this, how you can act in good faith and all of that, notice first of all, their argument has actually no offensive material. It is purely defensive. They have no grounds to win on. But also look, no, it's often entire hospitals, as the info slide says, that means that you are simply incapable of driving to your local hospital to access any health care. But also secondly, even if it is individual doctors who are doing it, we think that the ways that they're probably going to stop their patients from accessing these healthcare is probably going to be very traumatizing. They're going to say that what you're doing is fundamentally evil, something that is going to damn you to hell. We think that these things are very, very awful, and they should just say, we'll let you do this surgery, right? But also, even if it's true that this individual may feel trauma from this healthcare service, we think that for the same reasons that these doctors are probably going to go through years and years of this training, they're probably going to be talked about through this, through either like mental health services to ensure that they are fine with doing it, but also if they find things gory, then they're probably not going to be a doctor in the first place, like opening opposition wants you to believe in. What did we tell you here? We told you that this was principally justified and very important, and we gave you 3 reasons as to why this is principally justified. First, people give up a massive amount of personal autonomy so that doctors can take on their special role. You gave up the right for you to do all of these different things to your own body, and that doctor takes on that role. But secondly, the doctor consented to taking on this special role. So the Hippocratic Oath means that you must provide the best care for your patient. But third, your personal beliefs should not infringe on other people's access to healthcare. We thought that that was really important. We thought that similar to how a captain is the last one to get off a ship, the doctor has a special burden that means that they should not be allowed to object in healthcare. We think that feelings should not play a role in the individual's access to their own body. It is not up to the doctor to say what is good healthcare and what is not. That's why we thought it was principally justified. I'll take a POI now from closing, if there's one. From opening.
Yeah, so your doctor can't just traumatize people because there are laws in place that prevent them from chastising patients.
Look, you actually have to give a reason as to why you're probably not going to do this, your conscientious objection. The reason you're probably going to give, if you, for example, believe in religion, is that you are killing a baby, right? We think that these are probably going to be the things that exist. We think that it is very, very bad for the patients. No matter how you try to skirt around it, it is probably something that is very traumatizing and something that has to not affirm the other individual's beliefs. The second argument we told you is how this provides vital services that people often require. And what Alex told you is that we explained the types of healthcare that are likely going to be objected to are often the ones that are marginalized and most disadvantaged groups that are refused healthcare. We think that these are things that are often used to justify through things like religion and moral compass. And I think that closing opposition is probably going to bring something up really sneaky about developing countries or something. We think that they're probably not going to be exploited in any way. This is about refusing the ability to have healthcare. We think that it's probably a choice by the patients. It's not going to be coercive in any way. The impacts we access were threefold. First, many individuals cannot access healthcare that they desperately require. So individuals who can't live a day in their own body or need abortion in order to continue to survive and live a good life or need medically assisted death because every breath is painful to breathe, we think that these people should be allowed to make their own decisions for themselves. If you live in Florida and your local hospital does not give you gender-affirming care, you are screwed, and we think that is really bad. But the second thing we told you is that this probably sets a precedent. So this makes it very justified on opposition more and more for doctors to just refuse surgery outright, because even if it is a slight annoyance, because we think that feelings, when they play more into healthcare, it's more likely they're likely to not allow it. So that takes out opening opposition's frame here. But third, we think that this reduces the chance for people to do healthcare on themselves. We think it is very dangerous because we think that a lot of the times these types of pieces of healthcare are very important for people to live their normal lives and to function. If you take that away, they have to do it on themselves. So what is the way here? We think that for maybe the 10% of doctors who may be traumatized on your side of the house, there are the 100% of patients who are always going to be traumatized by the fact that they cannot access the things they desperately need. We thought that that was one of our paths to victory. The fact that we simply are incapable of giving a lot of individuals the rights that they need and the ability for them to live accessible lives. But secondly, we thought this was principally unjustified. The fact that you simply should not, as a doctor, ever refuse an individual's healthcare because that is their own personal choice and never the doctor's. For all of those reasons, we were very proud to vote.
There's an extraordinarily large hole out of opening government's case. It is the fact that if you're an abortion doctor, or if you're someone who does sex change, you probably studied this thing and you probably specialize this thing because you already believe in this thing. It is highly, highly unlikely that a doctor who spent so many decades, so many years specializing in procedures such as abortion is all of a sudden going to be like, actually, I don't want to abort babies no more because I believe that that is a life that is valuable, something like that. That is to say that the kinds of procedures that they say are going to be vital operations that are controversial, that you want to protect, are not up to the doctors. It's not like you're going to a general physician who's going to refuse to do an abortion because it is morally against them. You're probably going to an abortion doctor to ask to do that abortion. And insofar as they spent so much time studying this one thing and being actually capable of doing this one thing, I don't see why this idea of refusal of controversial operations falls into the scope of this round. Couple of things then. I'm just going to do very simple refutations because I'm rebuilding to my partner's case, weighing in this entire round. All right, we hear two main arguments. Firstly, they say there's a principle of life because you consent and give up your autonomy when you allow doctors to make decisions for you, and therefore they should help you. All right, let me do a couple of key pieces of framing. When do doctors actually, when are they actually going to make this decision, and what kinds of decisions are probably going to be made? Firstly, I'd like to note that any doctor who makes such a decision has to have a significant amount of their conscience that is violated by giving you the surgery, or has to have a significant amount of justification as to why they would make this. The reasoning is very, very simple here. Doctors could get fired if they do this. They could lose money. They could harm their reputation if they refuse to do this care and word gets out. Insofar as they're willing to actually tank all of these negative impacts. Insofar as they make this decision and tank it, it is highly, highly likely that it's going to be extraordinarily violating to their conscience and extraordinarily bad for them. All right, second thing then, the kinds of people who go into medicine. We tell you that people are going to go mostly into medicine and things that they morally themselves support. Why would you become an abortion doctor if you don't support abortion? Why would you become a sex change doctor if you don't support sex change? That is to say, in these cases where they are very, very much invested in helping people in that particular way they have studied for so long, if they refuse it, then there's probably a very, very good justified explanation that they themselves, at the very least, have to be able to rationalize to make this decision. What then are the decisions that are likely to be made? What do they actually look like? If it's not things like controversial policy, etc., things like that. I think it is very, very simple. It is when they refuse to do, say, usually when you give medical advice to a family, you give them several options of the kinds of surgery they could do to achieve, say, a particular outcome to heal a person. The only reason why they would then interject and be like, actually, I don't want to do this surgery, if they believe that that parent or that guardian or whoever is making that decision necessarily made the wrong choice that is against what they know or what they believe. Because note here how it's probably the idea that they're violating or they're not actually going to be helpful, or that the surgery that they're forcing them to do is not going to be beneficial in the way that they should be beneficial in helping people's lives, that is the actual case and scenario. Why people are likely to actually opt out of doing surgeries, etc., things like that. Why does it then matter more that we're not harming the idea of like principle of life, etc., things like that? I think it is very, very simple. Let's do some weighing here. They say principle of life, consent. But I think what's most important is the fact that we want our doctors to be able to make the best decisions possible and to be able to work well in the long term, because that is how we're able to get most saving of lives in a beneficial way. Oriana gives you the most important mechanisms then about why this is going to be why this is not going to be the case. It is very, very simple. Doctors, nurses operate under extraordinarily high pressure. They're susceptible to a lot of things. They're susceptible to things like second-guessing themselves, etc. If you second-guess yourself, if you lose concentration in the surgery room, you can nick an artery. You can quite literally kill someone from the smallest move. Insofar as you're pushing people into specifically doctors, into the experience of doing something that fundamentally violates their conscience, their self-identity to such a great degree, it is very, very likely, because of how proximate things like conscience are to you as a person, it's very, very likely you're going to feel the harms. You're going to rethink this while you're in the circumstance of an operation room. You're very, very likely to be in that moment and be like, last time I was in this operation room, I did a procedure I didn't agree with. I'm far more likely to think back on the outcomes of that procedure. It is far easier for someone to then blame themselves if they're like, I didn't make a conscientious rational choice, I went against my conscience and something bad happened. They can put all that blame on themselves. And insofar as this necessary trauma is going to occur in the operations room that they have to continuously go back to, you're decreasing the ability of doctors and nurses in general to actually concentrate to give you good quality health care. Lastly then, on this idea of like service in general, of like delaying time to get service, and why we're actually far more likely to actually still have alternatives for people to get these procedures done, etc., things like that. I think it is very, very simple. Based on the framing I gave you at the top, and about the scenarios in which doctors would make this decision, it is highly, highly likely it is not going to be the entire hospital who somehow has the same moral conscience. It's not going to be the entire health care system who is against this procedure. That is to say, if you refuse that procedure, it is very, very likely there's going to be a different doctor with different conscientious norms that's going to give you this. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
OO did not take our POIs, so they did not have a chance to answer the question that I was thinking to myself, which you should be asking yourself at the end of this speech as well. Who is going to be pulling a conscientious objection? By not answering this question, they take an incredibly low burden and almost scroll the motion by basically implicitly conceding that most doctors aren't even going to be doing it. So now it's just going to become a debate about whether or not doctors deserve the choice. If you have problems with that, POI me later, but you might want to save those to engage with the moral extension I'm about to run on OG, because I feel like this is going to be the most important part of this debate. Because keep in mind, what are we debating about here today? We're not going to be debating about the reputation of the hospital or how well they can curate their, business or whatever. We're debating about the lives of real people and the choices that they are making that are deeply intrinsic to themselves. So what did OG tell you on this principle? Because, I feel like this is sort of obligatory if I'm going to be running a vertical extension. They explained the Hippocratic Oath and why doctors have an obligation to operate. The thing about framing it as an obligation is that this does not generalize it to all cases or stand well against O's attack. What does this actually look like? Well, on the idea of institutions versus individuals, this doesn't really matter, because the thing about vulnerability is that it's the patients who are the ones that are actually going to be dying or potentially surviving this procedure. The patients suffer as a consequence, and also there's practical mitigation. The doctors have been receiving training, and the patients are the ones who have weighed all of the things and said, maybe what, I do want to go for this option or something like that. Furthermore, there's a principle of choice I'll be expanding on a lot more later, but the thing is, there are two cases and one of them has been talked about extensively, another one has not been. The first one is about life-sustaining services. This is the one that we say, we're going to keep this person on life support, or the doctor is not just going to, unplug some serial killer, or something like that. The second case is about euthanasia and the like. And this can escape the debate on the front half about whether or not this is in the doctor's interest in extending lives and about their moral obligation to society because of the material benefits that they have accrued. And then I'll be taking this debate into justifying why, even in the case of euthanasia, the doctors are still not justified in choosing their own moral preferences over them, which takes a higher burden than our opening half, which should win us this debate. So, why is this true? What is this round principle here? You're essentially enforcing your own moral preference on another person. And notice that all of the harm is occurred on the patients. So why is this something that the doctor is much obliged by? Because in the moment, the doctor is in a uniquely trained position where they have minimized all of the risks to mental harms of providing treatment, and they are also the only ones who can probably provide that life-saving treatment on the fly. If someone collapses with a heart attack, like, I don't know, outside of the elevator, you have about 3 minutes before they're gone. And the person who gets there first, if they realize that it's a serial killer who murdered their entire family, they're still probably not in the moral right to, like, I don't know, just say, oh, you know what, maybe let's not perform CPR on them. Why is this true? Because if the doctor refuses to provide euthanasia, or if they refuse to provide any choice, something both opening teams missed in their idea about like payback and education is that they're implicitly putting their own moral preference over the patients, and this is what I mean by choice. In every case of intervention, they violate the moral preference of the patients, which proves that even though, which proves the motion even on the burden the opening did not know existed on euthanasia. And even in the case of euthanasia, why is this justified? It is because moral preferences are entirely arbitrary. It is not the doctor's place to say that death is worse than life that awaits a patient, or it's not the case for them to say like, oh, you know what, you're gonna have to face that American medical bill. The thing is, the patient has made this decision that death is preferable, or that the small chance of life is worth it. And we sidestep the opening deadlock of trying to implicitly weigh these moral preferences by saying it is entirely in the decision of the patient, because ultimately, this comes down entirely to what the patient truly believes. Second point on precedent, but first, sure, I'll take a POI for closing. Come on, guys. You can do it. Okay, opening. Let's go. Opening.
Also have like their own moral preferences, so why shouldn't that be valued?
Doctors only have, okay. Because the harm is uniquely incurred on the patient, and also because when the doctors, think about it, the patient is the one who's going to die. Like in this case, the doctor is essentially taking like, well, I think that this person might or might not be good for society, or this doctor is just like weighing something entirely arbitrary versus the patient making their own choice. And the principle that we're protecting is a principle for the patient's own autonomy and the principle of the patient's choice. And because they're the ones that are being affected, I think that's the most important one, sure.
The doctors aren't overriding the decision of the patient. They're opting out of making that decision whatsoever. The patient can still go find someone else who will...
Okay, if someone's having a heart attack, I don't think they're going to suddenly get up and go to a different hospital. Like, the doctor in the moment has to be making this decision, so it's entirely on the doctor. And the reason why this motion needs to pass is so that there is something that mandates this officially. Now there can't be a precedent for the doctor to just say, well, I didn't know, and these conflicting moral preferences to just collide with each other, potentially even getting the doctor fired on your side, which is the worst case that you don't want to talk about, but you know what, I'll be charitable, let's talk about your best case. In the cases where the doctor has to make a split-second decision that concerns the patient's like well-being, there's no time for an alternative, and there must be this official limit on the doctor's like, I don't know, God complex, so they can't just decide that suddenly this person gets to live, this person dies, you live, you live, you live, you live, you're cool. All right, so lastly, okay, I don't have time for that, never mind.
First, I'm going to refute all of side government, and then 2 points of extension. One, why this is fundamentally unjust. Second, on why this is practically bad. CG tells you that people also have moral obligations and doctors shouldn't override it. But doctors also have their own moral preferences that are more proximate to them, and since people have a greater obligation to care about themselves because they know what's best for themselves, they should care about that more. But also, doctors are not preconceiving what their conception of the good life and placing that upon the patients. They're not telling someone not to get a euthanasia because their life would be better if they continued living. It's because the doctor morally doesn't want to kill someone. There's a difference. Second, on OG tells you there's like a reciprocal obligation from the doctor to give back. One, what's the margin of change? This is extremely small. These objections happen very marginally, so other doctors could probably still fulfill this. But second, in the situation that they talk about, we're heavily conservative areas. In those areas, abortions are probably banned on either side of the house, so that's not big of a difference. But also, the reciprocal obligation is the state to provide these resources, not the doctors themselves. On to our first point of extension. One, doctors, although they be more crucial at a profession, it's unclear why they're different from other individuals and citizens. They're all constituents of the same state, and they all owe this sort of agency that the state should give them back. Look, they have a special obligation, we agree with that on opening government, but that only exists due to vulnerability and not uniqueness and skill. That's to say, if I'm in an operating table, I place all my trust within the doctor, so they have an obligation to do no harm and only try to help me to the best of their abilities. But notably, inaction is not doing harm. If I don't even agree to that in the first place, I'm not actually violating this principled obligation of unique relationships. But second, to live a good and dignified life, you need agency and autonomy. People have different preferences. You need to fulfill this, and this also applies to doctors because they know what's best for them compared to the state or someone else. That's to say, what is best for you is extremely subjective. People are religious, believe it or not. People have their morals, and people have their own conscience, which are deeply important and personal towards them. And so on their side of the house, you're literally forcing doctors to continue doing something that they do not want to. They spent years building this in order in school. They spent like almost a million years, like not years, like they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to go to medical school. They have families and communities that are reliant on them for this job. That's why these are coercive pressures that force them to continue being a doctor if they don't want to lose their job, and therefore you force them to do this. Fourthly, this is extremely, extremely bad because you can't maximize your own autonomy, and hence you can't reach actual fulfillment because you don't have the agency in doing what's very best for you, and hence you can't access the right to a good and dignified life because you know what's best. But fifthly, this is very interesting, lack of evidence of existence is not proof for non-existence or absence. We don't have the epistemological access to know whether hell and heaven exist or not. We don't know if there's a other metaphysical reality. And insofar these people believe within these truths, if they actually commit euthanasia, if they did an abortion procedure, this is extremely bad. You're condemning them to internal hell and internal disutility, which is very, very bad. It is immoral. We cannot do this. And lastly, on this principle, it's basically just it's principally unjust for governments to restrict actions that restrict freedom. You can ban guns because if guns were legal, more freedom is restricted because we also derive our agency and autonomy from the actions of other individuals. In this case, since I've already refuted opening government, we've proven to you there's not a huge trade-off. People can still access medical care to the same degree. Therefore, this is an over-exercise of the state's power, and this is principally unjust. Second argument on why this is practically bad. There's two parts here. No. First, if you live in Utah, where 50% of people in Salt Lake City and the Utah surrounding area are literally Mormons. They do not support gay people. You cannot get a blood transfusion. They can't perform these sort of procedures because that is extremely, extremely bad. Therefore, a lot of people within these areas just wouldn't become doctors and nurses in the first place because the proximate fear of hell and eternal damnation is a lot higher to the potential benefits that you can derive from being a doctor in the first place. This is very bad because you actually end up overburdening the medical system. When a lot of people aren't willing to become doctors and nurses in the first place, doctors are forced to be overworked. Nurses are forced to be overworked. They're spread a lot too thin. You can't get care as to the fast of a degree, and you can't get the care to the same quality. And this is extremely, extremely bad. The second part of their point then is basically if you live in developing countries like the Middle East, in which you have a lot of religious rhetoric, when 90% of people are either Shia or Sunni Muslims. Therefore, when you view the doctors as abiding by these sort of metrics in which they agree, okay, we will perform abortions, we will perform blood transfusions, we will do all these things, that the people actually perceive as immoral, and the people themselves also don't want to get because they disagree on a moral and conscious sort of metric, we think this loses and deteriorates trust within the medical system in the first place. We don't trust the doctors when they're different from you, when they're violating God's will. This is why when you have little bruises or you have a concussion, you wouldn't want to go to the doctor anymore because you view them as less legitimate. You don't trust them as much. It's on all these bases very proud to oppose.
Let's firstly break down where does proximate fear actually come from. If you are, as CO pointed out, a Mormon believer, even if your doctor chooses to save you and gives you that blood transfusion, the moment that you're able to regain your livelihood, you're immediately ostracized by your community. We think there is a reason why individuals refuse those services, and therefore, because they understand themselves better outside of the disease that they have and outside of that healthcare environment that they're in, they're able to make the best decisions for themselves, and consent is something that we must debate in this round. So on that basis, very proud to propose. Okay, I just want to break down this round by 3 themes, and I'll be contrasting our contributions to each team. Firstly, on this idea of what ultimately this best interest looks like. Secondarily, on what the consent, what role the consent of patients play versus the ability of doctors to overrule and override. And then lastly, on this idea of future outcomes, which mostly came out in opening teams. Okay, let's just firstly engage with the CO extension on basically why doctors are individuals and therefore they will probably have good intentions, right? I think one thing that I told you directly is inaction isn't actually harm in this case, but the moment this inaction is tied to other goals, it is harm. And judges, if you think about what they told you, which is that those doctors have spent many years building knowledge, chances are their decision when they judge whether or not to give an individual this sort of healthcare service or not is already biased because they have a perception of the better outcome. For example, if I give them this life-sustaining treatment, this person will likely live. Whereas if I don't give them that, they might just pass away in a moment, trigger warning as well. But I think what's important to note here is that individuals understand the consequence of those decisions that will be bared by themselves, right? So for example, even if the doctor is able to save that individual's life in this sort of like life or death moment, I think it is not worthy for us to override their consent, because even if they were safe, they might not be able to sustain this sort of livelihood after the treatment, and it is for that reason that doctors do not actually have the ability to make the best decision. Now, secondarily, like on this idea of freedom, right, and I guess just like agency. So what our opening team tells you is that essentially like there is this idea of like personal agency, and you submit that to the healthcare services, and therefore they should not infringe upon like your freedom and autonomy. So I think the reason why we beat them is because we provide you the better principle on why it is that individuals have better perceptions of what the situations they face. And also, I think it is kind of low burden to say that you submit your autonomy, because insofar as you accept any forms of like government provision services, you are submitting a part of that. But like, why do we actually like end up like beating them with our like extension then? So what we told you is that institutions at the end of the day will not be able to make the best decisions for individuals, because ultimately like the consequences of any sort of like treatments that they go through is essentially still like going to trickle back to the patient themselves. And it is for that reason that if you don't know what's the best interest for those patients, and if the patient is unable to consent, you don't act on it. This is the principle of healthcare, right? If you don't understand what is best for the patient, and if you don't have that information from them, or if they are unable to consent, you don't act on this just because you think something will provide better outcome. Now, quickly going on to some more engagement with OO, right? I think they tell you more about this idea of like knowledge and why like doctors must act or like make the decision that they think is the best for the patient, and how this is probably going to play a role in like future healthcare decisions as well. I think first of all, like all of the teams have been able to point out that like in the moment, this sort of like life or death situation, it's like very urgent for the doctors to make a decision. So like chances are this sort of like future, like, sorry, give me one sec. Like I think this sort of like future consequences thing is like, it doesn't matter in the round, because what matters is like the livelihood of this individual. Now, secondarily, on this idea of like the trauma that you incur on those doctors, I don't think that's as significant when an individual that accepted the service that the doctor prescribed to them without their consent have to live with it and are unable to afford it and therefore live a much worse life. I don't think that is like something we should accept. Actually, I'll take back. Yeah.
If I'm like a doctor
Sorry.
and I'm religious, maybe the person really needed a blood transfusion, but I still want to operate on them, so I'll prescribe them like I don't know, like plasma transfusion, and that's like more inadequate towards them. That's likely to happen.
Okay, I think the thing is, like all of the rounds having trying to justify what this best interest looks like, and I think all of us agree that like in the ideal world, everyone wants to live, and the doctors want their patients to live too, right? But I think the thing is, doctors operate specifically in their specialty, and therefore all they consider is whether like the outcome of this treatment is going to be good or bad, whether they're able to treat this disease or not. They don't actually consider what the life of a person looks like after they receive this treatment, right? The individual is the only person who is capable of deciding that, whether or not they want this service. And oftentimes this is not just because they don't want to live themselves, but rather because they think even if they accept that service, there is not going to be much improvement to the quality of life that they enjoy, right? I think we're the only team that explicitly paints to why it is that like those individuals are much better actors, even in the case where they can consent, than doctors. Because no matter what knowledge that you have, no matter what interest that you hold, when you try to override this sort of like patient's like perception of where they are in life and what quality of life they actually receive after this treatment, you're already overriding this idea of consent. And I think that's something like really principle in healthcare that none of the other teams have been able to prove. And so like everyone that's like listening to this round, if you don't want your doctor to make decisions on your behalf, well, you know the consequences are still incurred on yourself, and that you have to like take on your shoulders those burdens. We're proud to.
Proposition euthanizes the human soul. This whip is going to be simple. Firstly, we're going to explain why CG is out of this round, then move on to OG, and finally explain why why we outweigh our own opening. Let's go on CG. In a POI, we asked them why doctors were less important. They say that harm is uniquely on the patient, and therefore we should only care about them. But who decides what harm really is? Why is it that physical pain for a day is worse than traumatic experiences for the rest of your life? Is your life even valuable and worth living if every single day you can't get over the fact that you've committed a massively grave sin? We think CG can't play God with this principle and decide that patients are always going to be the most valuable inside of every circumstance. The second thing to note here is that there's the idea of moral proximity. This only furthered our own case, and Jerry already explained to you as to why you have an obligation to your own moral compass more than anybody else inside these scenarios. The last thing to point out is that their case is contingent on two things. The first is a cherry-picked example of a person having a heart attack and dying in 3 minutes. Very, very unlikely, even if we concede that that's like maybe one person. Secondly, it's contingent on the fact that people are denied access in the first place. We already explained to you that that's not in the spirit of the motion. It is very likely that this healthcare can be passed on to someone else. This is extremely critical. If their case is contingent on individuals not receiving care and it being overridden, then it is no longer a principled argument anymore. It is one that is practical and as to whether or not individuals are going to get practical healthcare under this motion. Therefore, they've probably fallen out of this round, both on a principled and practical level.
Do I?
CG is completely out of this. No, thank you. Why is it that we beat out OG? The first thing I want you to do is take a gut check.
They say you give up your autonomy in exchange for someone to operate on you, and that operation is like very critical, and that therefore you have to operate on them. This makes no sense whatsoever. I want to go skydiving. It's something that's life risky. If I give this guy all my autonomy, does this guy have to take me skydiving?
Probably not. It's unclear why you forcefully giving up your own autonomy now means that they have to operate on you whatsoever. There was no consent for the doctor to operate upon you, even if you offer your entire life towards them. That was extremely unclear. The second thing to note here, they never proved why you as a doctor have to be the one to provide them care. We would argue that the burden of providing care probably shifts onto a larger medical provider. That is to say, in this scenario, it probably looks like the hospital. If the burden is to help this individual out, our side can fulfill that burden if there are other doctors around that are willing to help you. We think that we fulfilled this. The third and final thing to note here, every single other mechanism under this principle was that doctors are very special people and therefore they have a special role. That was no mechanism whatsoever. Military individuals are also special because they have an obligation to defend the state. But we still allow them to have things like moral consciousness, where they can choose to become battle nurses and not harm the lives of other individuals. And the reason for that is that we value individual autonomy as one of the most important things inside of this round. I'll take you later. The second practical claim coming out of OG says that doctors are like, you have less access to doctors because a lot will opt out. I think firstly, quite simply, CG correctly pointed out that this motion probably is more on the principled basis. Because it is already not really used in the status quo, it doesn't really matter. But secondly, in most of these regions where you have things like abortion being banned in the first place, these places already have many of these services banned in the first place if they're very, very hyper-religious and most of their doctors don't want to perform this. So it's unclear where the margin of change inside of this round is. The third and more important thing I would argue is that we take their impact as doctors. Because if you look at our second practical claim, which was completely unengaged with actually, it explains to you why, one, current doctors will have incentives to quit because they never consented into this policy being implemented in the first place. And secondly, that doctors people who wanted to and aspire to be doctors will also be likely to quit. And that's extremely important inside of this round. In places like Utah, we explained 80% of people are extremely, extremely religious. They see a lot of medical practices as being a grave sin where they're condemned to eternal damnation for the rest of your life. That's infinite disutility. That's probably something that's very terrible. And even if you make $100,000 or $200,000 a year, it does not matter if you're going to suffer for the rest of eternity whatsoever. These people are fully going to quit on their side. POI.
Look, skydiving is not the same because you legally cannot do your own surgery by the state. As a doctor, do you not think
okay,
that
but like
not doing
if
something
skydiving
is
was
equal to
also illegal for
regulation?
you to skydive yourself, then like the same thing applies. The point is that like just the doctor never consented in this scenario. Even if you want to offer them reasons to do it, you want to offer them your autonomy, it doesn't make it reciprocal. That's where the logic falls. Why is it that then we then beat OO out of this round? Two reasons why we outweigh OO. The first, quite simply, is how low impact their case is. And OG correctly points it out. Most of this is defensive material. At best, it's neutralized and there's nothing important that happens. And no, if you listen to their own refutation, they say people don't want to pick doctors who aren't 100% sure. So why is it that then their own practical analysis is that people go to these doctors who perform badly on them? It contradicts itself. But secondly, I think just the idea of identity itself lacked a lot of nuance. They only say that identity is integral. Jerry explains to you the principled importance of having identity inside of your life. Not only why it is something that's so integral to your quality of life practically, but also on a principled level why individuals are deserving of this choice and why Proposition uniquely strips that away from them. Very, very proud to oppose.